Okay, I'm speaking today about Ayn Rand and Friedrich Hayek. They were two of the most important and influential theorists of the free society and defenders of the free society in the late 20th century. But they differed radically in the way in which they attempted to defend the society. They differed across pretty much the whole realm of philosophy, especially including both ethics and epistemology. But today I'm going to focus only on epistemology. There we go. Sorry. The first topic I want to, just by way of introduction, I want to contrast their views about reason and freedom in a general way to set the context. So Rand and Hayek on the power of reason. Ayn Rand, as you know, held that reason is a faculty that we exercise deliberately, by choice, initiating the effort of thought, taking responsibility for the results. She held as an epistemologist that reason is efficacious. It's capable of providing us with knowledge of the world. And that includes knowledge not only of the material world and the world studied by science, but knowledge of morality and moral principles and political principles, that these were things that we could establish as knowledge by means of reason.
You're getting a little shadow of the screen.
Oh, thank you, sorry. Hayek, by contrast, held that moral rules are not discovered by reason. They occupy a status that he described in his last work, The Fatal Conceit, as lying between instinct and reason. They are not literal instincts in the way that animals have, but they are not rational either. They are customs acquired largely by imitation. We learn them, we pick them up in the course of being acculturated and growing up from our society. Where did society get them? Here, Hayek offers a basically evolutionary explanation. Our society has the rules it has, not because of great thinkers or discoveries, but because of all the societies that evolved and developed with different sets of rules. Ours was the one that was around. So he was an early proponent of evolutionary explanations for social phenomena. He was a critic of rationalism, a term that he used in a way that was not totally clear and somewhat idiosyncratic, but it certainly would have included Rand. The idea that one can, he said explicitly that no universally valid system of ethics can ever be known to us. And in the context, it was clear he meant known to us by means of reason. So for Hayek, the case for freedom is essentially negative. It is our limitations and our ignorance that should prevent us from having utopian aspirations of designing society from the top. Whereas for Rand, the case for freedom was essentially positive. It was the social condition that human beings need to flourish, to pursue their interests, to exercise their minds, and to trade freely. And in this respect, Rand and Hayek represent two different strands of Enlightenment thought. Rand is the 20th century, the best 20th century representative of the tradition of John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, the other thinkers of the era who prized man's power of reason and wanted to liberate that power, and so in society, in economics, in thought, in science. Hayek represents a somewhat different tradition, sometimes known as the Scottish Enlightenment, of social theorists, Adam Smith, David Hume, and various others, who were much more skeptical about the power of reason. They tended to look at man not as the subject of a rational capacity that could that human beings could exercise as knowers and as doers, but rather as the object of social inquiry, and they tended to be somewhat more conservative, in a sense, in their views of human motivation and the limitations of reason. This is the tradition, however, that did give rise to the idea of spontaneous order and the really crucial explanation of how markets work without design. Now, I think these two traditions can be integrated, but as they emerged from the Enlightenment, they were at loggerheads, and they remain at loggerheads in the figures of Ayn Rand and Friedrich Hayek. Let me move on now to the real core of my topic. Rand and Hayek anchored their views about the powers of reason in respective theories of abstraction. And I've sketched a fairly stark contrast between Rand and Hayek about reason itself, and that contrast will get even more stark as we look at their epistemological theories about abstractions and abstractness. But first I want to note the fact that these two thinkers, outside academic philosophy, both of them, did both anchor in on what is really the core, a core epistemological issue at a time when the academic philosophers were not even aware of it, or if they were, they dismissed it as irrelevant to epistemology. In addition, there are some striking similarities between Rand and Hayek in areas outside epistemology, having to do with the way in which they used the idea of abstractness as an explanatory term in their understanding of society. One is the evolution of modern society. Hayek is well known. He stated an outlook many times that our modern civilization, what he called the extended society, emerged or evolved out of a much more primitive mode of social organization, basically tribal, small groups, in which people felt a high degree of solidarity. They exercised altruism within the group, and they were typically hostile toward those outside the group. And this evolved toward a greater degree of individualism. As people began trading, they began slowly having more mobility and began dealing with each other more as individuals. And so the evolution was, the particular most important aspect was in a small tribal society, cooperation, social interaction revolves around concrete ends. Organize this hunt, build these shelters, move to the grazing lands in summer, etc. Whereas when you are dealing with a broader set of interactions that individuals have with other individuals outside the tribe, then who are essentially strangers, then the only way to coordinate activities and prevent and encourage cooperation is by more abstract rules of fairness, property, contract, etc. So the essence of Hayek's view is that society evolved from a condition in which people were very concrete bound, to use an objectivist term, which their lives revolved around concrete ends and very specific relationships, to our modern extended society in which people trade globally on the basis of abstract rules with people they may not like, certainly have no kinship with, may not even know. Similarly, Rand saw very much a similar kind of evolution from group identity, the immersion, what you call tribalism, the immersion of the individual who takes his identity from the group he belongs to. The core of the tribalist mentality, which she was most concerned with, as it has, insofar as we still have it with us today on the part of too many people. But the essence of that tribal mentality is what you call the anti-conceptual mentality. People are functioned in terms of concrete modes of thinking, first level abstractions and not much beyond, so that moral rules for them are not principles that they understand as true abstractions, but rather as just rules. Do it. Here are the do's, here are the don'ts. Similarly, she saw civilization as the emergence of greater capacity for privacy and for individualism, and a movement from collective organization of production to trade. So in a way, although she was not as focused historically as Hayek was, they have very similar visions of what makes a modern society work. And finally, Hayek regarded socialism as a desire for the solidarity and altruism of tribal life. It is an anachronism, an archaic breakout in human psychology of something that just doesn't work anymore. In a somewhat similar way, Rand viewed socialism as a desire to make the world safe for the anti-conceptual mentality, to take out risk and the need to initiate and take full responsibility for your life. Another parallel is the role that each of them attributed to the rule of law. This was one of Hayek's major themes, and he was a student of law as well as economics. One aspect of the rule of law, the traditional notion that we are ruled by laws rather than men, is the idea that the law is general. It applies uniformly to all people, or at least all people who meet the conditions of the relevant law. There's no distinction between ruled and ruler. All are subject to it. There's no classes, no privileged exemptions from the law. And the function of this is not only justice and fairness in an ethical sense, but it is also epistemological. When the law is general and uniformly applied, then people can make predictions and they can make long-range plans knowing what the consequences will be. And finally, here I'll just make a nod to something that Jay talked about yesterday. Hayek articulated the problem of economic calculation and more broadly the impossibility of rational use of knowledge in a socialist economy, a top-down organized society, a taxis, in his term, neologism. Rand would certainly have agreed with this. Hayek tended to put this in negative terms. No planner, it's the limitations of human reason that make planning impossible. Why? Because we're not omniscient about all concretes. But actually, when you look at his models of social theory, he makes a point, a good Austrian economic point, that when you're dealing with complex systems, you can identify causal regularities, but only abstractly. Applying them to make concrete predictions is very iffy, if it is indeed possible at all, because there are so many variables and having the information in hand. But you can still know that the law of supply and demand works. You can still grasp how economies work abstractly, and that is exactly what Rand would have said. The economic calculation argument does not reflect a human limitation or a human failure to be omniscient, because that's not a relevant standard. What it reflects is the fact that we function abstractly. So in studying things, we go by abstract knowledge. All right, now let me get into my subject, and here's the point where Rand and Hayek diverge radically. In the introduction to objectivist epistemology, Rand dealt with the question of, sometimes known in philosophy, the problem of concepts, or the problem of universals, or the problem of abstractions, which arises from the fact that a concept like human is, first of all, universal. It is a term that refers indifferently to all and every individual human being. It's not a name for an individual. And secondly, it's abstract because it treats, in saying that someone is human, I'm saying, in saying that you are human, I'm saying exactly the same thing about you that I would say about you when I say you're human, even though there are obvious differences. You are two quite different individuals as individuals. So the question is, concepts have these two features, but what we see in the world is all concrete. It's not universal. It's all particular and specific, and it's not abstract. So the epistemological issue is, how could we acquire cognitive devices with these properties? How, by what mental process could we acquire concepts that are abstract and universal? And secondly, what justifies us in using these devices? Because they don't reflect reality, or don't appear to. If they're universal and abstract, but nothing in the world is universal and abstract, where's the correspondence? Those are the two traditional problems of, as I say, concepts, universals, abstractions. Rand's theory was that we form concepts by a process. I'm not going to go through this, but essentially grouping things together by similarity and difference. We form a concept by noticing that certain things are similar, the things within the inner cone here, and they all differ in a similar way from things that are related but outside the group. For example, we see that dogs, the dogs that we encounter in our neighborhood, the child, we're speaking of a child here, have certain similarities that, yes, they're all different. One's big, one's small, one's scary, one's friendly, and a little pussycat, so to speak, but he can still see it's not actually a pussycat. There's cats over here. The dogs are different. And so it's grouping those similarities and then forming a concept along the relevant dimension of similarity. In this case, it would be shape, behavior, furriness, etc. By contrast with things that have quite different shapes, behavior, and furriness, and whatever else. All right. Now, the important thing about Rand's theory from our standpoint of our contrast with Hayek has to do with the objectivity of concepts. For Rand, perception is primary. Our perception of the world is where we start epistemologically. And it's from that we form our initial stock of concepts, whether a child forms them by completely autonomous perception, or more likely is guided by parents who notice that the child is ready for this and then begins teaching them, calling attention to relevant similarities and differences. And the vast bulk of our concepts are not formed directly from perception. They are formed when we use the existing stock of concepts we have from perception to identify, in conceptual terms, we identify higher level, more sophisticated, more complex similarities and differences, and form concepts like government and justice and honor and particles and waves, etc. Nevertheless, without perception and the initial stock of concepts we get from perception, the game could not get off the ground. Perception is where everything starts, and it is our direct awareness of the world, which we have prior to any conceptual awareness, which is built on perception. That's one source of the objectivity of concepts. The other, and this is the direct answer to the question, how can something that is universal and abstract be a valid or objective way of dealing with a world in which nothing is literally, apart from us, universal or abstract? The answer is Rand's theory of, this is really a breakthrough theory, or a theory of objectivity, is that knowledge, all of our cognitive faculties are natural faculties. They operate in a certain way, and that structures how we do things. And therefore, objectivity has to be defined not only in terms of an orientation and commitment, orientation to reality and commitment to grasping it, but also a policy and performance of acting as your faculties require, integrating things conceptually and logically, precisely because we do not have the direct revelatory awareness of abstract truths. Rather than, and in this respect, interestingly, after Glenn's talk in the prior session, this could, in a sense, be called critical realism, but because of the tangled and bizarre history of those terms, we don't use that. But it is not naive realism. The mind is not a passive mirror reflecting nature. It is an active processor of information that gives us knowledge of the world. Okay, on to Hayek. Hayek's view was quite different. In an article called The Primacy of the Abstract, he wrote, "What I contend, in short, is that the mind must be capable of performing abstracting operations in order to be able to perceive particulars, and that this capacity appears long before we can speak of a conscious awareness of particulars. In other words, some mode of abstraction, he doesn't actually call them concepts, but something happening in our nervous system is actually an exercise of an abstract capacity, and that comes before perception, not after or on the basis of it. You could not ask for a more striking or flat distinction from Rand's approach, or for that matter, the approach of really all other empiricists. Why did he say that? Well, his view was based on a theory of neural functioning that he devised. Actually, he devised it initially in his youth in the 1920s and 30s, where he was very interested in psychology. He came back and wrote a book called The Sensory Order in the 1940s. He was trying to understand how the nervous system, as we knew it up to that point in time, could sustain or relate to our perceptual experience of the world and ability to identify objects. And he was reacting against a notion, a simple-minded notion that, as you see on the diagram on the left, we have a light source. Actually, this is an experiment involving a mirror, but it doesn't matter for that purpose. The light shines into the eye, and from there goes in a straight shot to somewhere in the brain, and that's where perception happens. Hayek thought this doesn't explain anything because it doesn't. There are just too many things that happen between the light source and the retina, and then way too many things that happen between the retina and the experience of a sensory color. What he came up with has excited a lot of people looking back now, because it seems like an early version of what's called connectionism or neural net theory, in which you have inputs to sensory receptors, and they feed into a layer of cells, and then those combine into other layers of cells, and that you actually have a complex kind of pattern recognition function going on, in which an experience like of red would be the result of complex neural processing and interactions along the way. Now, something like that is, and once it's obviously true as a theory of how the nervous system works, that nerves are densely connected, and much happens between the sensory receptors and the brain. Whether any particular connectionist theory is the best explanation, I'll leave that to the experts. But what Hayek's specific thought was that what's happening in the brain is that we perceive things, a single cell firing, or even a single small set of cells firing in response to some stimulus object like the apple, would not give rise to anything. It would not give us an experience of red. The experience of red comes from the fact that, for example, in the fire hydrant and the apple both stimulate and activate certain cells which fire at the same time. Okay, as he put it, I'm not going to read you the whole quote, it's a little technical, but so these cells are, when these cells are firing together, they are classifying things as red. And this all happens before consciousness. Whereas we have another set of cells activated in common by the apple and the beach ball, and those cells, when they fire together, that's in effect classifying round things. And so he's saying our perception of particular objects, concrete specific objects, is a result of a whole set of classifying activities on the part of the nervous system. Apart from those classifications, there's no connection between what's happening in the brain and what's out there in the world. As he puts it, sorry, did I skip a slide? No, I don't have it. What he says, I'll just read this to you. In other words, perceiving an apple, this is the bottom line, the takeaway from the theory. Perceiving an apple requires that the brain interpret it as an apple. okay? Which in turn means interpreting it as round, as red, as having a glossy surface, etc. But apple, round, red, glossy, these are all abstract terms that cover a number of things. So the brain is classifying into, in fact, using abstractions, creating abstractions prior to our ability to perceive the apple. Similarly, there are perception-action links, so that the experience of things is also dictated by what actions they give rise to. And in fact, he put forward a somewhat a modified version of behaviorism, which I'll say a little bit more about later. But the neurons that are activated, as in the model that I showed you, give rise to dispositions toward kinds of movements. Okay, a movement to flee, and then some other set of cells is flee in this direction, and it's the superposition of all these abstract orders being given by the nervous system as abstractions that combine into one specific movement. So these several dispositions can be regarded as adaptations to the typical features of the environment. And here's the key point: the recognition of such features as the activation of the kind of disposition adapted to them. The perception of something as round, for example, would consist essentially in the arousal of a disposition toward a class of movements of the limb. What it means to grasp something as round is, I feel my hand. Right? I go into the round object grasp motion. And that's what awareness is. It's that set of links in the brain. Okay, now we come to the differences between them. I think it should be obvious that this is a very different approach from Rand's. And I must say at the outset that it is extremely difficult to compare these views, because Rand was talking about a theory of psychological / epistemological theory of how mental functioning occurs in the formation of a concept. Hayek was talking about how, putting forward a theory of how the brain works prior to and giving rise to the conscious awareness that we have. Nevertheless, there are points of comparison that we can draw, and I'm going to bring them out first of all by talking a little bit about Hayek's theory as a early form of what's called functionalism in the philosophy of mind. One of the puzzling things to a philosopher reading Hayek is that when he talks about what's going on in the nervous system and the way in which certain groups of cells respond in the same way, in a regular way, to the same stimuli, and describes that as classification, what does he actually mean? There's something doing the classifying? Generally, we draw a distinction between causal regularities that we describe abstractly, right, versus the cognitive processes that employ abstractions. For example, a projectile that is fired in a certain direction with a certain velocity at a certain angle from a surface will follow a parabolic arc governed by certain variables. And we can say, I just said, governed by certain variables and the law of Newton's laws of motion, in this case, pretty much. But it's not literally governed by them in the sense that there's this law that they're obeying, that they're actually, that anything about the projectile is taking the abstractions, like there's a little captain in the cannon saying, say, you know, full speed ahead, Johnson, you know, 2 points to larboard. That's not happening. It's just, this is the way things like this act. And it's our description of them, our identification of the rule they follow, of the causal regularity, and in this case, the mathematical specificity of that regularity, that allows us to describe them abstractly. And similarly, there's a difference between acting in accordance with the rule versus following a rule. I get, we can talk about something, I'm stumbling for an example, something following a rule, my version of Microsoft Word apparently follows the rule, I don't really know, but it apparently follows the rule of launching any document I have at a view of 110%. That's too big for me, I want it smaller, but I can't change it. So it's always following that rule. But it's not like Word is saying, maybe a programmer said it, but not like what's right here on my machine is saying, I think we need a larger view, David. It's not like the personal assistant we heard about yesterday saying, you're gonna hurt your eyes or whatever. It's not actually applying a rule consciously in the way that if you might be about to tell a lie, you say, no, honesty is a virtue. It's not in my interest to tell this lie. Nevertheless, Hayek tended to speak ambiguously and equivalently. He says the formation, when he's talking about higher level cognitive function, he says the formation of abstract concepts constitutes a repetition on a higher level of the same kind of process of classification by which the differences between the sensory qualities are determined, the kind of subconscious neural classification that I explained a moment ago. And therefore, he sees a significant continuity all the way down from the neural perceptual level all the way up to the way we acquire customs in our, we adopt customs as, in effect, ways of classifying people and actions and the institutions. But that's happening at a level below our conscious control and often our conscious experience. Okay, secondly, the second main, I'm sorry, let me go back a step. The problem with this view, from an objectivist standpoint, is that concepts for all of these alleged functions that he ascribes to the nervous system, classification, rule, following as opposed to rule compliance, identification, building models, that's another part of his theory, building models of reality. All of these are concepts of consciousness, what Rand called concepts of consciousness. They are things that conscious beings do. They are modes of using the basic axiomatic fact of our being conscious, and the axiomatic fact that consciousness is awareness of something in the world. And it's stealing them from the context of conscious experience. We can describe all of these complexities in the nervous system in causal terms, and that's good. We have to do that. But attributing in terms of consciousness, or another term philosophers use, intentionality, ascribing intentional content to what's happening outside consciousness, is stealing these concepts of classification, abstraction, processing, computation, etc., stealing them from the root dependence on the axiomatic concept of consciousness. It is just invalid from an objectivist standpoint. All right, now let me move on to the Kantianism, because all of this, the obvious question to ask about Hayek's view, and particularly on the stark contrast between which comes first, perception or abstractions, is, okay, Hayek, where do these abstractions come from? They are, if you're treating them literally as abstractions, that is, as states with content, then you have to explain how we got them. It's not just, once you make the distinction between processing that is causally regular and amenable to abstract description versus actual use of abstractions, and if Hayek literally means the latter, then he has to say where the abstractions come from. Well, the answer is that some of them are hardwired, some of them are activated by early sensory stimulation, and then as we move up into more complex and complex cognitive functioning and into how individuals function in society. They're acquired from the society around us. So, but they're not anchored in perception in a way that they have this any Archimedean point. Indeed, many of them, he says, we cannot identify at all. We're not even aware of them. They operate in the way that he uses the analogy of knowing how to ride a bike. You probably could not, most of us could not on our own articulate the actual algorithm that we have to follow to stay in balance on a bicycle. And even if we know it, that's not how you ride a bike. In fact, it's almost guaranteed that you will crash if you're consciously trying to, I forget, it's something about the, never mind. I used to know it, and I never rode a bike that way, actually. So in most cases, there are all kinds of knowings how, and that's what he thinks basically all cognition is. So if they don't come, if these rules come from, not from an objective grasp with a foundation in perception, a perceptual awareness of reality, what we're left with is a kind of materialist version of Kantianism. That is materialist because it's all based in neural theory. And this is a point often made about Hayek's epistemology, and he says it himself, really. The qualities that we attribute to the experienced objects are, strictly speaking, not properties of that object at all, but a set of relations by which our nervous system classifies them, or, to put it differently, all we know about the world is of the nature of theories, and all experience can do is change the nature of the theories. Perception, in this sense, this is a version of the idea of perception as theory latent that Glenn was talking about earlier today. Now, from an objectivist standpoint, any such claim is self-refuting because it doesn't apply to itself. Hayek put forward this theory as a theory that he believed to be true and founded in perceptual observation. And it's unjustified because where did the theory come from? The theory came from a whole stock of information and research that Hayek was drawing on. He was calling on brain theory, observations from psychology, from ethology, from sociology. That he was relying on the entire theory of evolution. And all of that knowledge he takes to be knowledge of the world in such a way that he can say, oh, but our knowledge of the world is not really grounded. It's just a model that we can tweak, but we can't ever really fully validate. Okay, the final point of emphasis I want to make, or the final point of contrast that I want to make, is on the subject of active versus passive cognition. For Hayek, and I hope this now makes sense in light of what I've explained so far, for Hayek, conscious thought gives us some ability to modify the categories and the framework, conceptual framework that govern our perception, but not much. We have some ability to modify our theories by experience, but not fully, or in a fully grounded way. We have some ability to modify the rules by which we operate in a society, the moral rules, the customs and laws, but only up to a point, and that point comes pretty soon. So that what Hayek says, and he's quite clear about this, toward the end of his essay, The Primacy of the Abstract, he says, and I'm going to read this and try to digest this, it's Hayekian style, which you can choke on, but it's important. The formation of abstractions ought to be regarded not as actions of the human mind, but as something which happens to the mind, or that which alters the structure of relationships which we call the mind. In other words, we ought to regard what we call mind as a system of abstract rules of action, while every appearance of a new rule or abstraction constitutes a change in that system, something which its own operations cannot produce, but which is brought about by extraneous factors. The implication then is that the human mind the human, and therefore the human individual, is very largely a passive vehicle, a kind of node in which various relational interactions occur. One way to put this is in terms of the whole idea of spontaneous order. And here I'm going to hope that I can call on your memory of what Jay was talking about yesterday. In a sense, Hayek is taking his model of spontaneous order that he applied to societies and applying it all the way down. In his social theory, particularly his economics, he says, we have this complex system, society. It's made up of units, individuals, to some extent families and firms. Those units, the means their actions are coordinated to make the system function in a coherent and orderly way by what? Well, by law, contracts, property, etc., and on a broader net, by custom. Okay? So the individuals are acting as individuals here, not governed from the top down. And the picture you get if you just read that much of Hayek is, oh, this is individualism. And he himself described what he thought of as, what he held as individualism, in which the individuals are the active agents, and the social structures occur spontaneously, that is by, in fact, lawful consequences of human trade. But then when we turn to his analysis of the individual, oh, now it's the individual that is the complex system. And we're going to explain it by what? Well, the units now are neural structures, cells, cell assemblies, larger processes, rules built into the system, the means of coordination by which the fantastically complex system, the brain, produces unified, coordinated action on the part of the whole organism, is a whole set of perception action links that are abstractly specified. So now you are not it's a very different picture of what you are from the one you would get from reading just the social theory. You are a place where a lot of stuff is happening, like a society, okay? But without a whole lot of top-down control. And top-down control at the individual level means conscious, deliberate control by a self that is a real integrated entity. So the conclusion I have to draw is that I think Rand's view of concepts supports a view of knowledge and mental functioning, which in turn supports genuine individualism, genuine philosophy of rights and of freedom. But Hayek's view of abstractions, for all his prescience and learnedness, I think is fundamentally incompatible with individualism. It gives us a picture of individuals not as agents, but as creatures of their society. And that's pretty much what postmodern theorists and postmoderns on the left have always said. So I don't see how Hayek's theory can actually provide a gain. That's not to deny the value of his analysis of use of knowledge in society, or his economic points, but the whole system as a philosophical / social system is deeply, deeply incompatible with individualism and freedom. Thank you.
Time for a great question. There's two.
John.
In your slide where you had the red objects activating the red cells or red neurons and the round ones activating the round neurons, and does that imply that we are hardwired omniscient?
Hardwired?
Omniscient.
Omniscient.
It's already there, we just have to get the right cells activated.
Well, I think any reasonable theory of perceptual functioning is that the evolution of our senses and nervous system have created ways of processing perceptual stimulation to enable us to detect objects and their features. And that happens through the exercise and operation of various specific cells. So this part I have no problem with. And indeed, we know a lot about the visual cortex and the layers that seem to be tuned to pick up different aspects of properties, including, and this is another way in which Hayek was kind of prescient in the way that Epicurus, or who is it, Lucretius, who was the first atomist in ancient philosophy, believed in the atomic theory. Democritus. Thank you, Fred. Was a little before his time in proposing atoms on very limited information and a lot of kind of rational speculation. The problem with Hayek, and it's that until the nervous system, it's a description of what the nervous system is doing as abstracting, okay? As opposed to responding in a causally regular way to features of the environment. Perception has to explain, here are features of the environment that we know we detect. How do we detect them? The nervous system needs to have mechanisms for isolating features, responding, getting in tune with those features. And there's some good theories about how that happens. And that is what enables our conscious awareness to be specific, to identify and be able to discriminate this feature from that or this object from that. I think that's clearly the case. But when it's Hayek's description of this as abstracting, as employing abstractions, and then goes on to say that our actual conscious abstractions, concepts, are just further reflections of something, of a whole set of abstractions that are happening below the level of consciousness. That's the problematic thesis. Okay. I talk about this more in chapter 2 of my book, The Evidence of the Senses. Not Hayek per se, but very similar theories. If anyone wants to follow up, I know this is a very quick tour of a complex subject. Marcia.
David, I may not be understanding correctly your description of Hayek's theory, but what strikes me is it seems like he's describing what happens in the minds of people who are not too self-aware. That, they're not being very conscious about their concept formation, and it's almost like he's describing what's going on in their subconscious when they make all these connections. So I was wondering what you thought of. Does that make any sense?
I think so. I think so. His description of how human beings by nature function is very similar to what Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden describe as what happens if you're not in focus, if you're just drifting, if you're not living consciously. And that's one of the reasons I see a similarity, an interesting similarity in their social analyses. Rand's view of the concrete bound mentality is, in one sense, very close to what Hayek describes as the tribal mode that we atavistically want to resurrect in a socialist society. But it's kind of close to what he thinks normal functioning is. That is, we just imbibe these rules and go with the flow.
Excellent talk, David. Bracketing the question of where Hayek and Rand may differ on theories of percepts and concepts, just focusing on, I guess, the nature of consciousness. I guess just as clarification, I'm wondering, is your objection to are you objecting here to the idea of consciousness being characterized as a kind of spontaneous order or as an emergent order? Or is it just a particular way that Hayek goes about creating one and having this kind of symmetry between his social theory and his psychological theory?
That's a good question, Jason. Thank you, because it allows me to I want to go back to this.
click on the slide on the left if you recognize
Oh, yeah.
it from that little tiny sign.
Uh-huh. There we go. All right. Again, there is an important but very subtle distinction that I did not speak to. In some way, human beings are, so to speak, built from tissues, including neural tissues. We are, in that sense, complex wholes. There's no question about that. And I believe in particular that consciousness is an emergent property of nervous systems of a certain kind, certain biological kind. I don't think we really know where in the evolutionary scale consciousness arises, but it does at some point. And in that sense, the idea that we are systems that can be explained by the kind of systems theory to an extent is perfectly valid. But the point about human beings and the phenomenon of consciousness, and in humans, self-consciousness and volition, is that we exercise a particularly strong form of what is in this kind of theory called downward causation. That is top-down control. A feature emerges as a property of a whole, and then that whole, as a new entity, has features that have causal powers to affect the parts. That's how complex structures maintain themselves in general, but in human beings, the really key salient emergent feature is consciousness, self-consciousness, volition, the conceptual power, which allows us to control actions and all the nerve cells and all the neural parts that control the action. So, and that's where our identity as individuals lies, and the reality. So we are wholes with top-down control, bottom downward causation, if you will, in a way that society is not. Okay, there are features that emerge in a society that have downward causation, such as, you have interest rates emerge, prevailing interest rates emerge in an economy, right, from millions of loan agreements and borrowings. And then those prevailing interest rates affect how individuals decide to buy homes or not buy homes. So there is a degree, but we are entities, emergent entities, in a much, much stronger sense that I think Hayek is undermining or denying so I would not, spontaneous order really is a specifically economic social, applies to that realm, but he sees the way biological integration into an organism as a whole, and particularly into a human being, as the similar kind of somewhat loose, systematic integration. Okay, I think that was probably it. Thank you.